For over a century, Wells Fargo was one of America's most respected banks. It was considered disciplined, conservative, stable. It was even one of Warren Buffett's most admired investments. But beneath the surface, internal pressures were quietly reshaping the institution. Employees were pushed to meet increasingly aggressive sales targets. Metrics became more important than judgment. Incentives became more important than stewardship. And eventually, the system began rewarding behavior that should never have existed in the first place. The fake account scandal did not appear overnight. It emerged gradually as institutional culture became distorted by incentives. Wells Fargo was founded in 1852 during the California Gold Rush. In the early American West, the company became known for transporting gold, mail, and financial documents across long and often dangerous distances. Over time, the stagecoach became one of the most recognizable and trusted symbols in American banking. But Wells Fargo's reputation was not built on branding alone. For decades, the bank was viewed as disciplined, operationally conservative, and stable. Unlike other financial institutions that aggressively expanded into higher risk activities, Wells Fargo developed a reputation for traditional banking practices and careful underwriting standards. That reputation became especially important during periods of financial instability. Wells Fargo survived the Civil War, the Great Depression, and emerged from the 2008 financial crisis in stronger condition than many of its competitors. While other large financial institutions suffered catastrophic losses tied to speculative mortgage exposure due to its conservative discipline, Wells Fargo weathered the storm better than many of its peers. By the early 2000s, the company was often considered one of the best-managed major banks in the United States. A major part of its strategy centered around cross-selling financial products to existing customers. Executives believed that customers who used multiple Wells Fargo products, checking accounts, savings accounts, mortgages, credit cards, and investment services, would become more loyal and more profitable over time. In principle, the strategy itself was not irrational. Cross-selling is a common business practice throughout banking and financial services. The problem was not the existence of performance goals. The problem was what eventually happened when institutional incentives became increasingly disconnected from judgment, ethics, and operational reality. By the early 2000s, cross-selling had become central to Wells Fargo's business strategy. Executives believed the bank's long-term profitability depended upon increasing the number of financial products each customer used. Internally, leadership promoted a slogan known as 8 is great, referring to the goal of selling 8 financial products per customer. To senior management, the strategy appeared highly successful. Cross-selling metrics increased, revenue grew, shareholders were rewarded, and Wells Fargo became widely admired throughout the banking industry for its retail banking performance. But beneath the surface, pressure inside the organization was steadily intensifying. Employees at local branches faced increasingly aggressive sales targets tied to daily performance metrics. When bank employees hit their sales target, their performance's goals were raised. Employees were expected to open new accounts, issue credit cards, enroll customers in online banking services, and generate additional financial relationships under extremely demanding quotas. Performance reviews, compensation, promotions, and even continued employment increasingly became tied to sales production. Former employees later described an environment dominated by constant monitoring, pressure from management, and fear of failing to meet quotas. In some branches, workers reportedly attended daily sales meetings, where performance rankings were openly discussed, and employees who failed to meet targets faced humiliation or disciplinary action. The pressure created a dangerous institutional dynamic. Employees began focusing less on whether customer relationships were genuinely beneficial and more on satisfying internal performance metrics. Over time, the system itself began rewarding appearances rather than reality. And once organizations become excessively dependent upon quantitative targets, people often begin finding ways to manipulate the numbers. Some employees resisted the pressure, even leaving the company entirely. But others gradually began gaming the system in order to survive within it. Importantly, this was not simply a story about individual dishonesty. Individual employees were still responsible for their actions. But the scandal demonstrated how institutional incentives can gradually normalize unethical behavior across large organizations. The deeper problem was cultural. The institution had become increasingly dependent upon metrics that measured sales activity, while becoming progressively less capable of recognizing the ethical distortions those incentives were creating beneath the surface. As pressure inside the organization intensified, unethical behavior gradually became normalized within parts of the retail banking system. Employees began opening financial accounts that customers had neither requested nor authorized. In some cases, bank workers transferred small amounts of customer funds between accounts in order to activate newly created products and satisfy internal sales requirements. Unauthorized debit cards were issued. Fake email addresses and PIN numbers were sometimes created, so accounts could be enrolled in online banking systems without customer knowledge. On paper, the metrics appeared successful. New accounts were being opened. Cross-selling numbers were increasing. Sales targets were being achieved. But beneath those performance reports, the institution was gradually losing alignment with its actual purpose. Importantly, many of the employees involved were not senior executives or high-level investment bankers. Many were ordinary retail banking employees working under intense performance pressure inside local branches. Compensation, performance reviews, promotion opportunities, and even continued employment increasingly became tied to meeting aggressive sales quotas. Employees who failed to hit targets often feared disciplinary action or termination. And in environments where institutional incentives become excessively tied to quantitative metrics, people frequently begin optimizing for the metric itself rather than the underlying purpose the metric was originally intended to measure. This is one of the most dangerous dynamics inside large organizations. Systems designed to measure performance can gradually begin distorting behavior instead. Over time, actions that once would have been considered unacceptable can start appearing normal inside the institution itself. The Wells Fargo scandal demonstrated how unethical conduct can spread gradually through organizational pressure, incentive structures, and cultural normalization. The problem was not simply individual misconduct. The deeper problem was that the system increasingly rewarded appearances of performance while becoming less capable of detecting whether genuine value was actually being created. In other words, the institution had begun optimizing the wrong thing. One of the most important questions surrounding the Wells Fargo scandal is not simply how the fraud occurred. The deeper question is why leadership failed to recognize the scale of the problem sooner. Wells Fargo is not a small organization. It's one of the largest financial institutions in the United States, supported by layers of management, compliance systems, performance reporting, internal audits, and risk oversight. Yet despite those controls, unethical behavior continued spreading across parts of the retail banking system for years. In many large organizations, leadership becomes increasingly dependent upon dashboards, production reports, and quantitative performance metrics to evaluate success. And while metrics are necessary, they also create a dangerous vulnerability. Because numbers can measure activity without necessarily measuring reality. On paper, Wells Fargo's retail banking division appeared highly successful. Cross-selling numbers increased. New account openings remained strong. Employees appeared productive. Shareholders were rewarded due to the company's performance. But the metrics themselves increasingly concealed the institution's deeper cultural problems. Leadership was seeing outputs. They were becoming progressively less capable of seeing the underlying behaviors producing those outputs. This is a form of institutional blindness that often develops inside large bureaucratic systems. The larger and more complex an organization becomes, the greater the distance between senior leadership and frontline operational reality. And when incentives strongly reward positive performance metrics, bad news often moves slowly through the organization. Employees may fear speaking openly. Middle management may avoid escalating problems. Metrics that appear successful can discourage leaders from questioning whether the system itself is functioning properly. Over time, organizations can begin optimizing for the appearance of success rather than the substance of it. The Wells Fargo fake account scandal demonstrates that when institutions become excessively dependent upon short-term performance, they can gradually lose the ability to distinguish genuine value creation from manufactured performance. And once that happens, the institution itself can begin drifting away from its original purpose without leadership fully recognizing the danger. By 2016, the scandal had become impossible to contain. regulators determined that millions of unauthorized customer accounts had been created over a period of several years. The public reaction was severe. Wells Fargo faced major regulatory penalties, congressional investigations, lawsuits, and intense national scrutiny. Executives were called before Congress and questioned publicly about the bank's sales culture, internal controls, and leadership failures. The scandal quickly became one of the most significant reputational crises in modern American banking. Public trust, which had taken generations to build, began deteriorating rapidly. Customers closed accounts. Employees faced growing public criticism. Investors questioned the institution's governance and oversight. Senior leadership changes soon followed. CEO John Stumpf resigned amid mounting pressure, and Wells Fargo spent years attempting to restructure its internal controls, compensation systems, and compliance operations. But the consequences extended far beyond financial penalties alone. In 2018, the Federal Reserve imposed an unprecedented asset cap on Wells Fargo, restricting the bank's future growth until regulators determined sufficient reforms had been implemented. The action was extraordinary. It reflected not simply concern over isolated misconduct, but concern about broader weaknesses in governance, risk management, and institutional culture. The scandal became a reminder that trust is one of the most valuable assets any institution possesses. Banks, especially, operate on confidence. Customers trust financial institutions to safeguard their money, protect their information, and act responsibly on their behalf. Once that trust begins to erode, the damage can spread far beyond immediate financial losses. And perhaps most importantly, the Wells Fargo scandal demonstrated how quickly institutional reputations can deteriorate once the public begins questioning the integrity of the organization itself. Reputations are usually built slowly, but they can collapse surprisingly fast. The Wells Fargo fake account scandal is not simply a story about fraudulent accounts. It is a warning about institutional incentives. Organizations become what they reward. When leadership prioritizes short-term metrics above stewardship, systems begin optimizing for the wrong outcomes, and reality can become distorted. Eventually, the institution itself begins to weaken from within. In the years since the scandal, Wells Fargo has implemented major reforms. The bank eliminated aggressive retail sales quotas, replaced senior leadership, strengthened internal oversight, and invested heavily in compliance and risk management. While reputational damage remains significant, the institution has spent years attempting to rebuild public trust. The scandal ultimately became a reminder that even large and respected institutions must continuously guard against incentive structures that distort culture and judgment.
Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe, and click the bell to receive notifications for future videos. Also, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. Support for the channel helps improve quality and makes future videos possible. Thank you.